All right, so I'm painting the outside of this house, and so here's where we're at right now, and here's a picture of it before. So you can see how really shitty this looks here. So we're actually going to, in this section, we're going to replace it because the wood is so bad. But up above, I primed it, scraped it, sanded, primed it, puttied it, sanded it, primed it, and then put primer over the top of it. So, okay. Okay, and you'll notice that here, this is going to sound insane, and most painting contractors are going to think I'm out of my fucking mind, but we are taking it from this, so this is the original, and we are puttying it to create this look. Now, the reality is we could, this is a brand new piece of siding. Some of the siding is really messed up, so we're changing it. These two had a hole in it, so we replaced that, and then we're replacing some around the corner, but it's expensive. It's the middle of 2024, and cedar is very expensive, and so it's actually more advantageous, I know this sounds crazy, to putty it. So this video is going to be talking about how to get from this to this. So we're not going to do it everywhere. So if I come around to this backside, which nobody ever sees, and you'll see this alligatoring effect right here, is what I'm trying to avoid on this side. So, but on this side, we're going to leave it, right? We'll just scrape it, prime it, and paint it. And on this side, we are scraping it, priming it, puttying it, sanding it, priming it again. So I'm going to walk you through the steps really quick. Okay, so the tools I'm using here, this is a carbide blade. They have other scrapers out there, but they all suck. These carbide blades, they're kind of expensive. The blades themselves are expensive, but they're the best for getting paint off. I'm using 60 grit sandpaper, and I folded it up this way. If you haven't seen, I've got a video on how to fold that up. That's a 5-in-1 stiff putty knife, which I really love, and a dust brush. Okay, and you'll notice that I'm doing since I'm puttying and sanding, I'm trying to collect most of that on the plastic. That's why I've got this piece of plastic down here over my tarps. Over here, I've also taped up some plastic just to show you what to do. This is, again, just to kind of collect what's going on here. So you can see these work pretty well. Staple. I want to get that out of there. So I do the majority of my scraping with this, but you could use the carbide most of the time. And with a really sharp blade, it takes the stuff right off. Now, what you're just trying to do here is get down to this kind of a space, right? And then I'm just going to sand it. I'm just going to do a small area so you can see. Okay, and you don't want anything to look like it has light underneath it, if that makes sense. So this looks pretty, it's sound, right? So it's fine. If I can't scrape it off with a scraper, that means it's sound to the surface, and I'm satisfied with the way that is. Okay? Now, once you do the sand, I'm moving through this kind of fast, but it's basically the process, okay? And dust it off. Okay, so then we got that. All right, I'm gonna use Benjamin Moore's Fresh Start. This is an all-purpose water-based primer. Okay, now I know that contractors are gonna get pissed at me because I'm using water-based, but I don't like oil. Oil-based paints, over time, dry hard. When they dry hard, wood expands and contracts, and the oil base becomes brittle and it cracks. So I like the success that I've had with the water-based product. Now you can brush this on. I also have this Pelican roller, which I just love. So you could technically, not technically, you could, you could roll it on. And now I'm gonna let that sit for at least a couple hours. Let that sit for a couple hours, and then I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna show you how I putty it. Now I know it's a lot of work, but you know, in my opinion, it's absolutely worth it. So yeah, if you're a general contractor, this might be insane because you're not gonna make any money unless you charge up the butt for it. But I think it just makes a world of difference. I mean, we're going from, so that's scraped and primed. Here we are at putty before sanding. So okay, and remember, you should always, when you're on the outside of a house, always prime first before you put putty or caulk down. You need something to bind the putty to really well. And then when you're done sanding it, then you want to prime it again. You never want to put paint right over the top of putty. Okay, so I'll be back in a couple of seconds with the puttying of that spot. Okay. Here's the putty that I use. I use Crawford's Vinyl Spackle. It's easy to apply. It's super smooth. It dries fairly fast, depending on the weather and conditions, of course. It's a little bit, I'm in Seattle, it's a little bit cold right now. Not awful, but like in the mid-60s, so it takes a little bit longer to dry. I buy it in a gallon, and then I buy usually a couple of these quarts, and then I put the, I just take it out of the large can and put it in the smaller can so it's easier to control. Make sure you keep the lid on this really tight so it stays nice and moist. But you can see it's a really nice, smooth putty, easy to use, easy to sand. I use it inside and outside. It also is, because it's vinyl spackling paste, it has flexibility. One of the problems with a lot of putties out there is that they dry so freaking hard that they don't expand and contract, and that always becomes a problem. Now, there's a lot of times when you don't have a choice in that matter where you have to use a really hard, strong putty, but I try not to use that, especially with the siding. So I like to use the vinyls, this Crawford's. Anyway, I'll put a link down below for you so that you can grab it up. All right, so here's the putty. Now you could keep the lid on it while you're working, and you want to make sure that you do that because this will, if you're not careful, it will skim, it will dry out on you. So I like to use a wet rag and then lay it over the top of it to keep the moisture in there like that. Okay, so then you're gonna put some on. And then I'm using a 5-inch blade here. You could use a smaller blade, but you want to make sure that it's flexible. Okay, because it's easier to control that, and my smaller one is flexible as well. Okay, and this just allows you to put on more at one time, right? So apply it and then slide it down. Okay, this takes a little finesse. Okay, so apply. And then down on the bottom here, I don't really want these ridges down here, so I'm just gonna add a little bit more down here. Okay, and that's all you really need to do. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you just want it to be smoother, right? The difference between, you know, this just looks so much nicer. It looks nice, just like the new siding. So you see I got an imperfection here, but I'm not gonna deal with that. It looks fine. This is 1,000 times better than that, right? Okay, so just apply a coat, and then you need to wait for this to thoroughly dry. This usually takes, I usually do it the next day. I'd let it sit for an entire day before I get to it. So you just want to keep going across, right? I know it's a lot of work, but it just looks so much nicer. All right. All right, so I'll come back to that when I'm ready to sand, and I'll show you the final step in sanding and priming. All right, so this has dried overnight. It's about 60 degrees this morning, and it's sanding just fine. But I wanted to point out a couple things. You see how it's kind of dark? This was kind of a thick spot. So you can see it's a little bit darker there. That means it's still wet. Okay, so this is sanding fine, but I'm not going to prime it till later today. So I'll go ahead and sand it, and then I'm gonna let it sit. I'm gonna make sure that it's nice and dry before I prime it, okay? Now I'm using 80 grit sandpaper first, and then I'm using 120 on the second pass. The 80, it gets a lot of the material off. Right, as you can see, it leaves grooves. So then what you want to do is just get a quick shot of the 120. Okay, and you can see how nice and easy it just sands off of there. Okay, and there you go. And then once it's primed, then it's ready to paint. Okay, so I've just got to sand those last two pieces, but I'll do that later. But I'll come back and show you the priming of that later this afternoon. Okay. All right, so the paint is nice and dry, or the putty is nice and dry. So I'm just going to take my roller and just simply roll it on. And I like the way the roller leaves a little bit of texture in the paint. That doesn't bother me at all. In fact, I kind of like that. So it's so super smooth. So this is just coming out of the roller pad. All right, and that's it. And then once that's dry, we're ready to paint. Okay.